Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to this webinar this afternoon. My name is Thilo Kroll. I'm the PPI National Network Site Lead here at UCD, and on behalf of our PPI Ignite team and Dr. Emma Doris and Liam Clear, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar entitled PPI, the Role of the Publisher. So what is PPI? So there may be different terms in use, including public involvement, engaged research, patient and public involvement, but fundamentally all these terms refer to an active role of members of the public in research. This ranges from working collaboratively with academic researchers to set a purposeful research agenda and research priorities, to being co-researchers who are named on grant applications and engage in research publications. So nothing about us without us is a famous rallying call. So it's an attempt really to shift accountability and decision-making in research to a collaborative approach. So PPI is not only an ethos, but a way to ensure that research is more aligned with public priorities and understanding. So PPI Ignite, the national network on PPI, is the result of a cultural shift, or the endeavor to undertake a cultural shift, as well as practical alignments of stakeholders in research. Public and patients have a stake in funding decisions and how research is carried out and how research is presented and reported for maximum and most effective use. In Ireland, the Health Research Board and the Irish Research Council have invested substantially in achieving this cultural shift. PPI Ignite is an effort to build a national network between universities and over 60 national organizations to embed PPI in all health and social care research. So national network is led by the National University of Ireland in Galway, and UCD is one of its principal partner sites. This webinar is part of our first PPI annual festival, and we're delighted that UCD is supporting this festival with a number of events, including this webinar. Festival stretches itself over a 2-week time period. Today, the focus is the role of the publisher, and we're starting initial conversations. Publishers, both for journals and books, play a vital role in dissemination of research findings. As we are moving to greater involvement of the public in all things research, what is their role, or what could be or should be their role? Today, we are delighted to welcome representatives from 2 major publishing houses in the health field to start an initial conversation about this role. And we're particularly delighted, and it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Grace Mulcahy from UCD, who has agreed to host and moderate this panel discussion. Professor Mulcahy is an esteemed colleague at UCD and has a very extensive track record in veterinary sciences and health, as well as in publishing. So I'm now very pleased to hand over to you, Grace. Thank you very much, and a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Thilo, and a warm welcome to all of our webinar participants today. As Thilo has said, my background is in veterinary medicine and veterinary science, but I also lead the Research Culture Initiative in UCD, which we can tell you a little bit more about in the discussion. And indeed, PPI is very much at the heart of research culture, involving all of the stakeholders in research. I'm delighted that we have 3 excellent panelists here today to take part in our discussion. And we decided just for fun that we would introduce them in reverse alphabetical order, just to kick the bucket on that one a little bit. And we will take their presentations in the same order as well. So first of all, we're joined by Zareena Saleem, who's a journal specialist for Frontiers and Rehabilitation Sciences. And Zareena works with this journal and is responsible for acquiring high quality content for the journal in the form of themed article collections or research topics and manuscript submissions. And for the purposes of today's discussion, it's important to note that Zareena was involved in the patient and public involvement in disability and rehabilitation research, special research topic that featured in the journal. Secondly, we have Ciaran Fitzpatrick, and Ciaran is a senior editor at BMC Medicine. Prior to that, he was a BMC series editor on clinical medicine titles, including BMC musculoskeletal disorders. He was involved in academia as a researcher himself through involvement in preclinical models of psychiatry and neuropharmacology at the University of Copenhagen. And nowadays, his main passions are open science and championing patient and public engagement in research. He's looking forward to handling robust and reproducible science related to cardiology, nephrology, and psychiatry in his current position. So just to give you a flavour of the format of today's session, what we will be asking each of our panellists to do is to give an overview for 3 to 4 minutes of their experience with PPI to date, giving also some background to themselves and their publisher organisation and what their role is within the publisher. So that'll take us about 15 minutes. And then the most important part of our discussion is we want this to be collaborative and to have a really good discussion. So for the remainder of the time, for about 25 minutes, we will have a guided discussion. I have some questions here that I'm just dying to post to our panelists, and I'm pretty sure there will be some good questions coming in from the floor as well. So that's how we will proceed. And I'm going to ask then Zareena, first of all, to give us your overview of how you see PPI and your involvement in it. Thanks, Zareena.
Hi everyone. Yes, so my name is Zareena. So just to kind of like start in terms of PPI, so in regards to my experience, this is something that is relatively recent for me. As previously mentioned, so I was involved in the Patient and Public Involvement in Disability and Rehabilitation research project, and my kind of like main role within this project, I would say initially, was fairly administrative. So I acted as one of the primary points of contact for coordinating the next steps with our journal specialty chief editor Tylo, and also external researchers. So essentially trying to get the conversation going and really kickstart the project, and working primarily behind the scenes. So as well, along with that, I was also involved in the initial conversations to determine kind of like the baseline of the project. So that was in terms of determining the progression of the project. So determining the paper to focus the project on, and also, reaching out to potential researchers and PPI groups, in terms of trying to coordinate the writing of the editorials piece specifically. This project as well, I collaborated with my manager, Brittney, who is also here today. And we kind of, worked together to kind of like push the project forward in that sense. I guess kind of like a little bit about me, as previously mentioned as well, I work for Frontiers, which is an open access scientific publisher, with the main aim of making science accessible and open for all. And, again, as a specialist, I kind of like am involved in terms of the day-to-day activities of the journal, which can vary from, handling and managing editorial boards, to also, doing market analysis and identifying key areas of trending research within the rehabilitation science community specifically. And again, I coordinate research topics which are often regarded as special issues or themed article collections. And my prior experience with that definitely helped me in terms of coordinating this PPI project. Yeah, I guess that's all from me in terms of, this particular project.
Okay, thank you very much, Zareena. And it's a good point in time for me to remember that I have committed the unforgivable sin of forgetting to introduce our third panelist, who is also from Frontiers, as mentioned by Zareena there. And that, of course, is Brittney Abernathy. And Brittney is the journal manager for Frontiers in Rehabilitation Science, working with Zareena. And she came into this area after working for the NHS in both clinical and research settings. And as a journal manager, Brittney is responsible for creatively developing solutions to deliver strong journal growth through the strategic development of content acquisition initiatives. Brittney has previous experience with PPI through her work in clinical research and has brought this interest into the publishing domain as well. So we're going to hear from Brittney shortly, but we'll just take a quick detour now from Frontiers into BMC, and we'll let Ciaran have his 3 to 4 minutes. Ciaran, over to you.
Thanks, Grace. I hope everyone can hear me. It's great to be part of the National PPI Festival. It's a great sign to see it in Ireland, both to celebrate the progress of PPI and also hopefully for me just to foster new relationships and opportunities. So as you can probably hear, I am a proud Gael and former Belfield graduate, where I got a neuroscience degree. And now I'm working with Biomed Central, also known as BMC, based in London. And yeah, for me, I was many years working for BMC series, particularly focusing on rheumatic and musculoskeletal disorder journals. And now I'm a senior editor with our selective higher impact journal, BMC Medicine. So yeah, BMC, we're part of the Springer Nature family. And yeah, whereas BMC, actually, you may or may not know, we were the first open access publisher founded in 2000, when many just thought it was just not possible, that open access was crazy and just not viable for publishers, whether that be for growth or profitability margins. And for us, what we're all about, we've always been about innovation and progressive publishing strategies, what many people have sort of mimicked as time has gone on. And for us, I'm going to touch on quite a bit, both now and later, is just for us, our ethos is open research for all, read and reuse, particularly for patients and public to be able to read what's going on in the scientific sphere. Inclusive, a lot of our journals, I think starting with BMC, with the exception of BMC Medicine and BMC Biology, they're sound science journals, meaning that they don't consider impact, interest, or novel. So it's less about publish or perish. And we're trusted, we're very robust, we're very transparent with our peer review. So my experience with clinical medicine and PPI, I mean, my road to Damascus conversion to PPI was when meeting patient advocates at journals when I started as an editor. And they were basically telling me, hey, look at this, patients should be involved, engaged. And when I thought about it, actually, you know what, they were right, but I just never had thought about it as a active researcher. So working with them, shouts out to Arthritis Foundation, Osteoarthritis Foundation International, based in Barcelona, to work on Springer Nature-wide approval and development of inclusive language guidance, because there's no point talking about engaging patient if you're not going to refer to them in like a non-stigmatizing, has to be in a respectful manner. We also worked on commissioning patient-led productions, giving like patients actually a chance to lead research and publication and not just be part of it, although we also commissioned that because yeah, too often it's about the researchers leading and getting input from patients, whereas we want to hear their voice. Yeah, that was not enough in my opinion, or I think most people's opinion. So in order to change editorial policies, you need to demonstrate feasibility and success. So we launched a call for papers for special issue in patient and public involvement in rheumatic and musculoskeletal disorders. And yeah, we had mandates such as getting feedback and developing the call via Twitter with patient advocates, editorial board members. We had patient reviewers included in this special issue, which we just closed. Guidelines taken from another great BMC journal, which we'll talk about. Plain language summaries, GRIP 2 checklist, and patient language statements were mandated. And we basically commission work with quite a lot with patients as leads or co-partners, with the aim of sort of constructive learning opportunities for researchers. And we're very happy, although we haven't published a special issue, that's to come in 2023. We were inspired the newly designed patient research partner course at ULAR Society. And yeah, I'm sure we'll get into more. There's been lots of successes, opportunities and challenges so far on it, but I'm aware that I have a finite amount of time to talk right now.
Thank you so much for that, Ciaran. That's a really good overview. And now we'll pass to Brittney.
Hi, thank you. So I'm Brittney. I'm the journal manager for Frontiers in Rehabilitation Sciences and Frontiers in Pain Research. We're an open access publisher. We're quite new. Frontiers itself has been around since 2008, but our two lead journals have just launched almost 2 years ago. So we're very proud of them, but they are quite little baby journals that we're working on becoming more PPI friendly. So that's been a really big push in the past few months, is how can we become more PPI involved. My personal background in clinical research has led me to become more and more interested in how to get patients and public involvement within both research and the publication of that research. When I was a pediatric research nurse, I led the PPI group for our institution, and the children and the patients were absolutely amazing. And we found out so many things about what's more important in research, what researchers think needs to be researched, or what the patients actually need themselves. And there's often a fairly big disconnect, particularly in pediatrics, between what we think they should value and what they value themselves. And I would imagine that there's probably a bit of a disconnect in what we publish between what's important to patients and what is important to clinicians. So that's something we're really trying to explore right now. We've been doing some deep dive into the data, looking at what manuscripts are interesting to the public versus what's interesting to our clinicians. And we can kind of see in the data that there are a lot of manuscripts that get a lot of information and that get a lot of attention on social media. The advocacy groups link and distribute, and those are not the same articles that get a lot of citations that we see a lot of views from our editorial board in. And this is something we're trying to think about how we can make the more clinical papers more accessible to the general public, because I do think that there are very clinical papers that would be of interest. And we're also, I mean, much like a lot of journals right now that are open access, we're trying to expand that open access. It's not just enough to be without a paywall and be accessible in the sense of being able to click on it if they can't understand it because it's not written in plain English. If it's not easily digestible, it's not helpful to anyone. So we're working towards creating a few research topics or subsections around PPI and around plain English research. So those are our next steps, and we'll see how that goes. It's more of a 2023 project for us. And as Ciaran said, it's really a wait and see with kind of what difficulties we're going to come up against, what new ideas people bring us, because the more you start talking to advocates and to patients, members of the public, the more you get new ideas thrown at you that you hadn't even considered, which is really exciting for us.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Thank you so much, Brittney. In thinking about what the next big developments in PPI might be from the journal perspective, one idea that occurred to me, and I don't know, maybe this is something that is in position in some of the journals, or maybe it's a bad idea, but I would like to bounce it against you guys. We're used now to have in all of our journal publications to submitting statements on ethics, for example, to submitting statements on data availability and data management. And in many journals, we're also used to using credit taxonomy statements whereby all of the co-authors are listed with what exactly their contribution was to the particular publication. Do you think there might be room for relevant papers on health and social care to have also statements on PPI, so that there would be a statement on whether the researchers consulted patients, whether they involved patients, and what the level of PPI involvement was? So I just wanted to bounce that idea off you and see, whether it's a good idea, bad idea, dreadful, whatever. So Zareena, can I go back to you on that one, please?
Yes, certainly. So I definitely think, obviously, as we actively do ethics checks as, required for science or research. So I think in terms of asking researchers, to complete a statement documenting if and how, they involve patients and the public in their work is definitely something that, could be incorporated as it's almost, standard practice to do it with ethics. So I think there's definitely room in that sense to do that for PPI. I'm not sure if Brittney has anything else that she'd like to add in that sense.
Brittney?
So we've been looking into kind of from a production side of things, how we can implement that. It's something that's starting to be introduced in other journals. We've seen it roll out. It doesn't seem to be a problem from our side. It's really just a matter of time before this starts coming out as well, because funders are interested in that, researchers are interested in that. And a lot of what researchers and funders desire from us as publishers is what pushes us. Individually, I think everyone here has an interest in PPI, and that's why we're here. But as an industry-wide kind of idea, I think the more that we get researchers and particularly funding bodies asking for this to be included, we'll be seeing more and more of it.
Great. Thanks, Brittney. And a reminder to our attendees that they're welcome to submit questions in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll get to them as we go through the discussion. But we'll just go to Ciaran briefly on that particular idea. Yeah. So are you of one mind with our Frontiers colleagues on that?
I'd probably go a step further. I think journals pioneering PPI are sort of already mandating GRIP 2 checklist, which is a reporting guideline, which for clinical trials, we use Consort. For animal research, we use ARRIVE guidelines. So as publishers, when we're checking, it's typically checklists. We like editorial policies that we can follow and checklists or reporting guidelines that authors need to adhere to. And with GRIP 2, the BMJ asked for in 2014 research involvement and engagement, a BMC title found in 2015. And this special issue that we've been running, it's sort of mandating GRIP 2 checklist inclusion. And that actually, you need to include a statement about patients. And it like these checklists, it's like a tick box. Yes, I've done this. Which page, which line number, and it says, and it's as easy as that. And I think it's an editorial issue. I think you can't, at production, it's just fine tuning it, making sure everything's formatted. At editorial, you need to sort of, that's our role. We have to have those policies in place. Otherwise it won't get done. You can't leave it to the authors.
Yeah, very good. So good to hear that that's currently in place, and I'm sure it will become more obvious to the research community that that's something that's not just a desirable thing to do, but actually a requirement and mandated by publishers as well. Another thing which I was very interested in, and I've seen mentioned in the literature, is the involvement of patients in writing editorial comments or commentaries on research articles. So again, I'm very interested to hear how common that has become within the journals that you guys are involved with. So Ciaran, maybe we'll stick with you for that one again, and then go to Brittney and back to Zareena on that one.
I think it's one part. I'd probably like to go a little bit further, because I think we do have patient commentaries, sort of like almost translating the research for the layperson. It's more ideal if you have a patient involved in the team that's publishing the paper, and they have a plain language summary that's been debated amongst all authors and sort of translate it into lay language. I think having other patients looking at other research, I think it can be misinterpreted sometimes. So instead of commenting on other people's research, at least it's my opinion that you should be involving them in the process. And you do it that way. And if further commentary is needed by others, great, let it do that. But it's when you have the research, make it the best, make it the most understandable, geared towards patient as possible.
Okay, Ciaran, thanks for that. And Brittney, would the same policy or same thinking be found in Frontiers as well?
Well, we'd really like to hear the commentary of patients and advocates, as well as have them involved in the manuscripts, particularly because we might have one group that has a very strong opinion, particularly advocacy groups, about a particular study or field of research, and other advocacy groups or patient and public involvement groups will disagree vehemently with that. Much like researchers don't agree with each other, we'd have a very boring world if we were all the same. And I think that it would be interesting to have a discussion, almost a commentary back and forth about that. What we're trying to do with this research project that we're putting forward in 2023 would involve commentary from various groups on a set of articles. Something that we're trialing, and what I'm quite interested in, is that the idea that they will be the authors of this. They will have an actual article that is searchable, that it exists in PubMed, that kind of has a value beyond just existing on the internet in this big void, that we can look back to. I don't think we should have this hierarchy where if it's not in PubMed or if it's not citable, it's not interesting. but that does exist. And I do think we as publishers should try to empower individual patients and groups, advocacy groups, to enter that world a little bit and on their own terms, perhaps.
Great. And Zareena, just to develop that theme a little bit, going a step further, I would be interested to know whether there have been any initiatives to involve patient groups, for example, in things like journal editorial boards, in reviewing lay summaries and other kinds of reviewing activity, obviously not peer review, but is there a role for patient review, for example, of lay summaries? And it would strike me that that's an obvious thing to do, if a summary is meant to be intelligible to the public, then to test it in that way. But also thinking about whether patient or advocacy group involvement in editorial board policies or journal policies is relevant or appropriate.
Yes, I do definitely think that having PPI groups, within editorial boards and, actively making comments within the journal or within the board in itself is important, and there's definitely room for it. Obviously, these things do take time, so it's not something that could happen, be implemented straight away. But I definitely do think it's something that should be done. Just as like Brittney said, it's important to have these opinions out there and, also coexist with the journal. So, they may not necessarily be within PubMed, but it runs alongside the journal and it still has the same exposure as that. And, to obviously help and push that forward, you would want the group that is currently writing the editorial piece to be within the editorial board, to have active kind of involvement within the journal itself, because having a PPI group coexist with a journal not only helps kind of like the movement in that sense, but also draw attention to the importance of having these opinions exist and coexist with research that's already out there.
Great. Okay, thanks Zareena.
Grace, can I make one further
Ciaran,
point
please.
on that?
Yeah.
Just as I understand, it can be a lay audience listening to us today. I think a lot of the journals we're talking about are open access, and why that is good for PPI is that we release for free reading and reuse immediately once they're published. So it's a different business model to what subscription journals have been historically in the past, meaning that they're behind paid walls and universities or libraries pay for that, which patients or the public do not have access to. So there needs to be serious consideration within journals. Like, you can't just say, yeah, we want patients to write to us or make editorials, because typically to circumvent like the subscription model and allow the papers to be free to read, someone has to pay an article processing charge before it's published, and you can't be asking patients or the public to pay that, because it's thousands at times. So, I mean, what we've been able to push, and it's not easy within publishing business, is a number of free commissioning things, but that won't be forever, and there needs to be a model or a program to sort of get that patient voice out there in open access journals.
Yeah, I think that's a huge question in terms of, the future of open access. And I think it's something that we're all struggling with, and the whole issue of pay for publication and so on. It's a major issue for sure. And I guess there's an equity issue there as well, in terms of, authors perhaps from jurisdictions where the economic cost may not be bearable as compared with, for example, Europe and the US. So that's a clear one there. Just as you're on, Ciaran, there's one question has come up here about your mention of guidelines in animal research reporting. And the questioner has asked about PPI guidelines. So strictly speaking, they're not PPI guidelines. I think it was the ARRIVE guidelines that you were mentioning there, if you wanted to just give a brief description of those.
Yes, the ARRIVE guidelines are for animal experimentation, so to ensure that animals are ethically treated, and the reporting is there for other researchers to reproduce research, because we want to minimize the number of animals we use and unfortunately euthanize. Yeah, GRIP 2 is different, but it's sort of the same thought, in that, like, transparent reporting is good for everyone, that we can reproduce research, but also we're being aware of using the right language to refer to someone in a respective manner, and we're treating people in an ethical manner. So like all these guidelines, they all come from something called the Equator Network. They're just to make sure we're doing research in the most ethical, safe and reproducible manner possible.
Great, and thanks, Ciaran. So I'm now going to ask a question of each of you, and I don't mind the order in which you answer it. We leave that to you. But I think, you know, we've heard some really interesting stuff here today, and I think the whole world of PPI, in particular, the involvement of the publishers has changed very radically since the advent of open access and since the kind of newer business models have come to pass. So the question I would have would be to tell me how you think that development can be accelerated and how will it change? You know, give us a flavor of some of the newer things that either are happening or you would hope will happen in the publishing world in general, but also within your own journals. So I'll leave it open who would like to take up the cudgel on that one. Ciaran, we might stick with you then.
Yeah, fine. Is there, just to understand, this is more a non-PPI question. It's more just general developments in publishing.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, for us, what's like a lot of fields, artificial intelligence is just changing everything drastically. Like we're having, like whether that's language checking software to improve authors' English, particularly those from non-English speaking countries as the primary language, or we're having issues with paper mills. It's something where there's nefarious companies creating researchers for doctors or researchers, so they publish in this unfortunately publish or perish world. So artificial intelligence is really advancing processes in editorial offices. Open access, I think you're going to see a lot more journals flipping from subscription behind paywalls to open access. So that open access story is nowhere near complete. And yeah, I think coming back to PPI, I think 2020 is a big decade for patients, and that like funding bodies are definitely starting to allocate and listen or funds to the needs of society and patients, that no more will we have questions that are just a little bit pointless, like for very basic research that is not going anywhere. This is in the medical sphere, and a lot more clinical research is geared towards the patients, their needs in society, because there is, let's face it, a finite amount of money to give around to academics and clinicians.
Yeah, and Ciaran, you do raise another really important point there, which is very relevant to PPI, and that is how we safeguard against disinformation and misinformation, which is relevant to patient groups from these unscrupulous or, you know, dubious publishing practices that may emerge. So I'll go to maybe Brittney or Zareena, who might like to comment on that.
Yeah, I think that we're fighting some of the same fights as an open access publisher as well. Paper mills are a really big problem, as are people that just are a bit unscrupulous, that are trying to prove things that didn't work in their lab results. And we have to do a lot with image replication or manipulation. So there are things the human eye can't catch, and without our AI, we would be hopeless. We wouldn't be able to catch these things. I also think that open access in general has really helped with replication of studies, because we're in the same position. I think both of our journals are very interested in replication studies, in studies that aren't necessarily the flashiest thing in the world, but are the kind of daily work that researchers and scientists are doing to actually progress. And some of that isn't very exciting or glamorous, but that's what it's what we desperately need. I mean, we have seen a lot of historical studies that have sort of then fallen by the wayside because they aren't the replication never happened, because those aren't things that are published. So but while I feel like we have a lot of the same problems or challenges, we have a lot of the same kind of view for the future as well. I think that a lot of the way that our review systems have changed and the way that our AI is integrated actually makes it a lot more open for PPI to be fairly seamlessly integrated into our editorial process. We currently have an interactive review forum, so our reviewers can discuss with our authors as they go through. They can have a conversation back and forth. Granted, people are in different time zones, so this is not quite as seamless as it could be. But from a technology point of view, this could be very interesting if we're able to involve patients and advocacy groups in this process, particularly in the kind of more plain English form of this, to have real-time feedback, to have that go back and forth so that there's a conversation between researchers and the public and the patients that are actually involved in this. I think it's important that we get people involved in the very beginning in the research side of things, but from where we're sitting, it's already too late by the time that it's come to our door. And so I do feel that that things like this, where using technology to get the public and patients more involved in the process is really the way forward. And I think we're going to see a lot of big changes in the next decade. I mean, if we consider 2000 to now, the amount of open access publications has just exploded. You can't even, I mean, I don't think there's been any big changes like this in publishing since the printing press, really. So it's going to be really interesting to see where technology takes us and where open access takes us in the next decade.
Since the printing press, wow, that's a really big quotation there. I really like that. Yeah. So Brittney, you mentioned replication studies. We also, I think, are aware that sometimes it's very difficult for researchers to publish studies which have kind of negative results, or maybe they're not so keen to publish them. My impression is that Frontiers is also very open to those kinds of studies.
Yes, we actually, in one of my other journals, we had a very big discussion editorial meeting about that last week, about the importance of negative studies and how difficult it is to actually write negative studies. So for the lay people, it's where it didn't work out the way you thought it would be. But it's very difficult in the sense of why didn't it work? There are lots of things to control for, but a really well-written negative results paper has an enormous value to the scientific community. It's not something that's very often published. We very much welcome them, and we were discussing how to get that information out there in a controlled way. So it's good that you brought that up. It's something that we do want people to know about. That's
very important, because otherwise people will repeat the same study and get the same result. Nobody will know. Yeah, true.
And it's a waste of resources and time.
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A box now. I'll go first to one from Idel Murphy, and I'll pose this to Zareena. And Idel asks if there's any concern that reviewers who tend to be subject matter or methodology experts don't have a good grasp of PPI approaches, and therefore the PPI sections of papers, even when the group guidelines are used, do not receive the same scrutiny and interrogation during the review process as the rest of the paper. So that's the question from Idel there.
Great. So thank you so much for the question. So in regards to, I guess, more so for Frontiers, it's like if a review editor, for example, feels that they don't have the relevant expertise in regards to a certain subject area, so, you know, in this case, PPI, they have the ability to then kind of transfer the manuscript to someone who has more of an understanding of that particular area. So I guess more so in terms of Frontiers' approach to this, it's a case of every reviewer or whoever reviews a particular manuscript will always have the relevant expertise for that particular theme or for that particular, you know, area of science. So in that case, things are scrutinized to a level that is required because a researcher would have, you know, the relevant kind of background to assess that particular section.
Yes, and I think that's really important. And Adele comments here that peer-reviewed publications guide future practice. So what is published as acceptable PPI impacts future PPI practice. So yes, so very much what we do impacts what we do in the future. So thank you very much for that. There's also a question from Adele.
Just on that point, Grace,
Yeah,
I'd say what if the handling editor doesn't have a good grasp of PPI? Like there's a lot of editorial board members, like we're constantly like having a back and forth conversation on this and trying to educate them because they're not even aware of it. So I think as much initiatives that we can do, whether it's special issues or whatever, like there's still a huge learning gap there. So what I would be motioning here, and we've tried with the special issue, and I know the BMJ and BMC have been really great in progressing, is having patient reviewers. And like that, we're not telling them review every single section of the Met, because we don't expect them to know how to run a clinical trial or to do like molecular studies. We just, the sections that you're interested and you know that is like the impact on patients, the plain language summary, you assess that for the PPI aspects. Because as Adele said, and it's a really good question, I mean, like what we publish is in print and it impacts practice going down the line. And just to go back, I think we should definitely return to this point in a few minutes. Like science is going through a bit of a misinformation crisis. It's like everything online. It's not just science. It's like social media has just infiltrated everywhere. Like we see it everywhere, even though you disable the notifications on your phone. And like, for example, one thing that I missed was these preprint servers that researchers can now post their paper before it's been peer reviewed, which might make sense to publishers, but for people in the public, it's really confusing. You see something in print, but it hasn't been peer reviewed. So what I would be saying is, while there is a misinformation crisis, at least in science, I think like reputable publishers, and I mean, we have resources where you can find reputable publishers and journals. Like we are really putting in steps to have multiple layers of gatekeeping, and that we're only publishing robust science.
Yeah, and I think Brittney would like to comment on that particular question as well.
Yes, I just wanted to add that because not everyone on the editorial board will have every expertise. So they might be really, really strong in methodology. They might be very strong in a lot of aspects, but not be strong in PPI, which I think is an excellent point and very true. It is a constant kind of evolving situation of trying to educate people about this. Some of our editors are very, very strong and very keen, and that's really fantastic. But depending on the journal and the section, a lot of basic scientists may perhaps not have any patient involvement, and so it might not they wouldn't consider that that's something that is important to them. In terms of kind of using the GRIP2 checklist, we don't currently use it, but it's something that we're going to be looking at. I think that involving the publisher in that side of things, we already do the ethics checks ourselves. We have a research integrity team whose job it is to check for the general ethics checklist that we use currently that are kind of industry wide. So if we can get to the point as publishers where, you know, we implement this industry wide, we should also be taking responsibility for that on our side and not have it just be kind of the editor's job to be looking into PPI. We do want them to become more educated in that, more interested in that, but I think that that's something that we can also take on and take responsibility for.
Great, yeah, thanks Brittney for that. There's one more question in the chat here. I think we may have an answer coming back to that through the typing, but I think it's important probably to address it, because the question is, what PPI article types do your journals accept? Are they opinion pieces, editorial, and what length would they be? So my interpretation of that is it might refer to articles written by patients and by other stakeholders rather than researchers per se. So assuming I'm correct, maybe Ciaran, you'd like to cover off that. You're still muted there, Ciaran. We have to just unmute you before we can hear you. Perfect.
Thanks, Grace. I mean, on any journal website, either in the section instructions for authors or submission guidelines, it will tell you quite lengthy actually what article types we consider. For us, BMC medicine, we consider everything. To be honest, we assess everything on a scientific basis. We don't really have word limits. That's another advantage of open access journals. And yeah, I mean, we're open to everything as long as it's written in a scientific based manner. That includes opinion pieces. We will consider, we do prefer like a, how do you say, we accept lay and scientific language, but we do require referencing. But any questions, I'm happy to drop my email around afterwards. And yeah, as I said, one of my aims for this coming on today was just to foster and start new relationships within my native isle.
Great, thanks, Ciaran. Zareena, from the Frontiers point of view, do you want to add to that, or would you be giving a similar answer as Ciaran from BMC there? We just need you to get.
It would be a relatively similar answer, yeah. So we do accept, you know, everything from opinion pieces, etc., and all of that is detailed on our journal website. In that case, in regards to the kind of like format and stuff, again, that's all relevant and there on the journal webpage. I'm not sure if Brittney wants to say anything in relation to that. No.
Yeah, I think you've said it all. Brittney, is there anything to add? No, I think we've covered one.
Sorry, I was just going to say that we don't actually say that there's a specific article type for PPI related pieces. It really depends on what you want to do. There are commentaries, perspectives, etc. So likewise, I'll put my email in later. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
That would be really good, and we appreciate that. So I'm now going to go back to each of you in turn, and I'm going to ask you to gaze into your crystal ball and to think about, you know, how far we've come in terms of PPI. You've mentioned some of the new technological advances already that publishers are able to use, like AI and so on. So I'm going to ask you two-part question. The first of all is, does the use of AI for the kinds of purposes that you've described here and PPI, does that have any dangers associated with it, first of all? And secondly is, if you look into the future, 5 years or 10 years, how would PPI appear from the journal's perspective? And that could include anything from, you know, how the open access landscape would appear, what channels people use to get their information on the research advances for the disease or condition that they're worried about. How would advocacy groups be involved? Would there be more citizen science? And how would the research landscape look from the publisher's point of view from the PPI perspective? Another question would be perhaps how we are dealing with disinformation and misinformation. So a lot there, but a good many to choose from. So with your crystal ball or your X-ray vision or your 2020 vision on, Ciaran, go to you first, and let's know then what ideally the future looks like from your point of view.
Yeah, I think that's the €1 million answer or question anyway. I think with AI, I mean, I'm not going to focus too much on that with regards to PPI, because I think they're sort of separate, because I think PPI is very much about the human touch or the human interaction and I think that's the danger of AI, that we'd go too much down the computational route and you sort of lose the essence of human or the interactions. And for me, like, I think a lot of businesses, publishing included, are sort of using more computational resources, and that may lead to less human input, whether it's editorial or production. So that would be my fear, but I don't think computers will never replace humans. They'll just sort of optimize it. I mean, for the future of PPI, I mean, that's part of the reason why BMC we're putting projects in place to demonstrate feasibility and success, that we can build the future, because the future isn't just like a dream. Unlike your crystal ball, you need to put the work in to sort of feed that, because we're more or less all scientists really working at publishers. So I think what we're doing is I think easy steps are just inclusive language. If the last few years, including Black Lives Matter, has taught us the power of language, and there needs to be written documentation and guidance for authors. Like, we need to educate people better. Otherwise, they'll just repeat the same mistakes, not because they're terrible people, they're just ignorant on some things. I think low-hanging fruit, which I hope are included in every medical journal or journal dealing with patient care, is sort of this GRIP 2 checklist. Like, we love these reporting guidelines. It ensures robust quality science. Other low-hanging fruit is plain language summaries. Like more and more journals are starting to use those. I think like all publishers should adopt those in the coming years. It's a very easy thing to do. Other than that, when it comes to that, I know it's very boring and very tangible expectations I've made. Further down the line, I honestly couldn't tell you where publishing's going. What I've spoken about is like 1, 2, maybe 5 maximum, because things on the online forum are just changing so quickly that it's really difficult to keep up with. And yeah.
Good. Okay, Ciaran, that's Ciaran's vision for the future. So I'll go to Zareena next.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of the way we see PPI, or even like from my perspective, is definitely a lot broader in that sense of just, creating a safe place for PPI publishing within our journal or within journals in general. Obviously, in terms of making sure that they're regulated and everything is being, kind of like formatted how it should be. And also, I guess, kind of like a seamless integration of PPI principles in terms of our publishing model and moving forward. And again, just a case of, making everything accessible and being able to cater to a wider audience, and, essentially making sure that plain English is almost like a fundamental that needs to be integrated, when researchers submit abstracts, and, having a plain English summary to go with it, again, just to make sure that, you're able to make everything accessible for everyone, and, cater for a wider audience in that sense.
Thanks, Zareena. And so we'll get the final look into the future from Brittney.
So I'm going to parrot everyone a lot, but I really think the plain English aspect is going to be huge in the future, particularly with the problem of misinformation. We have excellent studies that are out there that then get misused. We see this very often, where there's a really catchy headline about a piece of research, and the general public wouldn't have read it because it's not readable. But then we have journalists or bloggers who have written an entire story about this research that they either haven't understood or that they've chosen to interpret in a specific way for political or other reasons. I think that one of the huge ways that we can protect or help the community, kind of beyond patients and the public, but just in general, would be to have this as standard across all journals. I think it's a patient and public involvement question. I think it's an ethical issue as publishers that we really need to be aware of the fact that we might be publishing great studies, but where are those going when we've published them? And I think in the coming years, that is becoming increasingly a focus of what's happening to these things we're putting out in the world. Now that we're getting more and more articles, OA publishing is increasing. There's an increasing amount of information in the world, but it's harder for people to understand what's real and what isn't. So I think that's going to be a big focus.
Great. Okay. And just to point to some of the things which Emma has put in the chat there, which I think are informative for people. Some information on paper mills, there's a link there to that. We have a Promote Your Research site in UCD that's accessible to all our researchers, and that help people to avoid the kind of misinformation trap, the journalistic sensationalism trap. So people might like to have a look in there. And Ciaran, I see, has a hand up, wants to have an additional comment before I say.
Just to get us there, to help us as publishers and ensure plain language, we can get obsessed with jargon as well. I would say to anyone listening today is, we're very responsive publishers, that is, and we want to hear from you, like whether that's involving yourselves with editors, like if you would want to submit something, like, and you don't want to go through the task, or it's a very rough draft, like, we are friendly people. Write us an email, or if you want changes on a societal level, like write to your politician, write to funders in Ireland or whatever country and say, I want patient involvement part of your funding calls, like that you need mandated. Or if you have any media, like, I think there's so much ignorance both everywhere, and I'm not blaming anyone. Ignorance is just not having no knowledge of it. The media has to play a bigger role, and they need to, like, generate more hype for PPI and understanding, and sort of showcase the good examples and the great patient partners that are around.
Great. And I think Brittney has a final comment as well.
I just wanted to second that and say that we really need to hear from you. We're very open. We're just people too. We aren't anyone that's special. We came into this work. We're interested in you. We're interested in patient and public involvement. Please come to us. It's just drop us an email with ideas that you have. Even if you don't want to submit anything, we're really, really open, and we're always happy to have more minds on this.
Thank you, Brittney. And I think that's a really good point to sum up on. And I note that Thilo introduced the webinar by saying nothing without us, about us, really summarized the whole ethos of patient and public involvement. And I think that's a really good quotation. We've heard about the power of patients and the power of the public. So make your voice heard, I think, is the message. Involve politicians, the media, the publishers, tell us about what's required. We've heard about the power of open access and transforming research publishing. We've heard about things like the GRIP guidelines, which are important in safeguarding and ensuring standards in PPI. We've heard also about the power of language in lay summaries. And I would like to conclude by saying I've really enjoyed and I've learned a lot from what our panelists have said here today. And I think PPI is certainly a really important component of research culture, because research culture encompasses not only how we treat each other as researchers, but how we relate to external stakeholders. And in this case, of course, patient and public. So with that, I'll conclude today. Thank you, everybody, in particular to our panelists, Zareena, Brittney and Ciaran, for their very forthright and erudite contributions. And thank you very much again to Emma and to Thilo for organising. And thanks for everybody who attended. Thanks very much.